thank you, Carlos and Rita, because they immediately accepted this, the idea of this debate, although it was at the time even more vague than it is now. Then I'd like to thank, of course, the panel. They were very generous and brave also to enroll in this debate. And I'll present Sally Norman. She's a professor of the Performance Technologies, co-director of the Augmented lab at the University of Sussex. She has a doctorate d'etat in the University of Paris, and her research is in areas such as ancient theatre to digital networking. She coordinated international symposium on new images in Louvre in 1993. She's the author of strategic documents for UNESCO, the French Culture Ministry, and before she moved to Sussex, where she founded a cultural lab, a research lab, interdisciplinary in the University of Newcastle. She was also the general director of the École Européenne d'Image on Boulogne-Poitiers, and a associated researcher at FBAUL. And she was also, Sally was very modest and CV she sent. She was also the founding member of VIVA, Art and Artificial Life, an award by the Fundação Telefónica that became a reference in terms of life, and is also an artist. Then we have Heitor Alvelos. He was a pioneer in implementing design research in Portugal as a member of the Scientific Committee for Social Sciences and Humanities in the Fundação para a Ciência e Tecnologia, and director of ID Plus Institute of Research in Design, Media and Culture at Porto University. And at the moment, Heitor is also the director of the doctorate program in design at the Porto University. And finally, Alex Rothera is a designer and inventor with a focus on the intersection between feature technologies and contextual design. His work searches in the first place to understand people and the context, and then design products and technologies that answer those problems. He's a designer, an artist, and an inventor from the US, and at present is the co-founder of Domain Engineering and also Creative Act Google Incorporated. Has been working in correction in Fabrica, business research, among other places. The idea of this debate is to build upon the new aesthetic movement that has been going on in the artistic, electronic, technological community, and try to look at a different perspective, a complementary perspective, and how does aesthetics gets placed in this discussion. None of us is an aesthetics specialist, and hopefully that will bring a fresher perspective to this debate. I chose, was not my idea, but the initial idea, but I chose this work by John Oliver to start this short presentation. And the idea here is that I will give a short presentation because I'm in a very comfortable position because I will set the scenario, ask the questions, and then lay back and listen to the answers. The idea is not that we'll come up to conclusions, we were discussing it before, and if this works well, hopefully we'll go out even more questions. That would be the best result that we could expect out of this. But anyway, I think this work by John Oliver, Art Advertiser, on his relation with augmented reality and art, kind of sets the scenario for this discussion. If you're not familiar with this, basically it uses the billboards in Times Square in this case as markers for AR, and then replaces historical artworks on top of Calvin Klein or whatever billboards were there. And when we come to this debate of new aesthetics, one of the definitions that I think is quite concise and interesting is that new aesthetics is a collaborative attempt to draw a circle around several species of aesthetic activity, including but not limited to drone photography, ubiquitous surveillance, rich imagery, street view photography, a big net nostalgia. Central to me was that is a sense that we're learning to wave at machines, and perhaps in the glitchy, bumpy algorithmic ways, they're beginning to wave back in earnest. So, clearly, on this very broad definition, most of the artworks presented and exhibited in Plunc definitely fall into this inside the circle. So I personally think it makes sense to discuss and analyze it at this slide. One of my ideas initially was to apply as a methodology to start to debate something that has become very popular, which is design fiction. So basically, one of the guests that unfortunately couldn't be present was Joshua Rosen from CSH. He's a specialist in science fiction. So I wanted to ask him to present some examples of where science fiction authors in their novels elaborating on some kind of futuristic perspective of artworks, and we could speculate and elaborate on top of that. Unfortunately, couldn't be present, and to be honest, when I think of it, the only thing examples I think of artworks in science fiction books is these very kitschy, classic science fiction movies where these opening galleries with all these ladies wearing space age dresses, but the artworks are still oil on canvas and traditional, let's say, sculpture. So there's not much to do nowadays. But the idea of this debate is first to analyze and to discuss if this new aesthetic is really new and what it has to, what it implies to be really a new aesthetic, but what's really happening with technology and its relation to human sensory apparatus. There has been augmenting our capacity of understanding and observing the world around us. This is an example of a work by a group of students from the Royal College of Art that developed this set that allowed the wearer to adjust their sight and hearing in the same way they control the settings on the TV or radio, or basically we can focus on specific frequencies around, sometimes inaudible, and augment that and perceive things that otherwise are not perceivable. So, and this basically, has been going on, this evolution in all of our senses, even taste. The Japanese researchers developing systems that can emulate taste, for example. So this concept that the Russian doctors brought up of we humans living in a middle world between the micro and the macro, it's now getting broader. We're reaching all these new, breaking boundaries and reaching all these new areas of perception that were unreachable until now. And this can eventually lead to changes in the aesthetic definition and what we think of art in general. How can we perceive it? How can we build up new artworks? And a way and a methodology that we could apply eventually to speculate on the future of art when our sensory apparatus is being augmented is eventually going back to the history of the art and thinking what if our senses were even narrower. For instance, if we were all colorblind, probably Malevich Plex Square would make sense. I don't know. And so we can also look at the future in the same way. Looking back, history of the art with a constrained sensory dimension, and then looking at the future when sensory perception is being augmented. And technology is bringing us the possibility of seeing things that until now we haven't been able to see. This is an example where the author created an application where we can see the power of Wi-Fi signals. Basically, they're already there, the electromagnetic waves, you can see it, we get to see the unseen. Some of the other realities and things that have been going around that I think can contribute to elaborate, to speculate what art can be in this new scenario is, for instance, the research on artificial artists. So this is an example of a Portuguese researcher and professor in Coimbra University, and the research on computer-aided creativity and computational creativity. And the objective here is to develop artificial systems with artistic capabilities similar to their human counterparts. In our view, an artificial artist should be able to perform aesthetic and or artistic judgments. This is being able to assess the merits of the artwork it creates, as well as the works of other artificial or human artists, and to be adapt to the requirements of a dynamic hybrid society populated by artificial and human agents. So, adding to this, and probably going even to a upper level of this reality, the Bristol Robotics Laboratory has been developed this project, the emergence of artificial culture in robotic societies. So, and the challenges of this project and the objectives is to define what are the initial conditions, the prerequisites for culture, and once they have that, can we program a group of robots with these prerequisites and what environment do the robots need to live in? Assuming something interesting does happen, how can we make sense of what we observe, bearing in mind that it will be robots rather than human culture? Then perhaps the biggest question, if you believe we do see evidence in the emergence of a robot protoculture, is what we have learned about and what that protoculture has emerged, realized from robots to humans, or indeed any social species. So, and another reality that has been going on is this fusion of software and hardware. So there are several elements that probably at their confluence can bring out other manifestations of cultural artifacts and culture itself. This is an example of a piece by Paul Sharon, by Sterling Crispy, where a performance, in this case with a drone, generates a sculpture made by a 3D printer. So it's an art form creating another art form, and this transition between physical and virtual and physical that is happening so quickly nowadays. An example of it, eventually, even at the business level, is the popularity and the relevance of a conference like Solid, for instance, where they really focus on this collision of software and hardware and breaking these barriers between the virtual and reality. So, before I start asking some questions and pass the discussion to the guests on the panel, just a quick explanation. Slower. This is a video that has been very frequently mentioned in this discussion of new aesthetics, because it's also concerned on the way machines start to see and how machines see us in a way and see the world around. This is called robot readable world, as it is there. And it was very curious for me, particularly because for many years I've been involved in projects that use computer vision and the first time I came across this video was through the machine vision community, and it was really curious because this was the scenario I had around me for many years in the developers that worked with me, and I have to be honest, I never see any kind of poetics coming out of these screens where they were testing the computer vision algorithms, but suddenly this I don't know the name of this video, but just by adding music, for instance, and putting it into the perspective that this is the robot view of the world, suddenly it gives a completely different story and narrative to it. And this is one of the critical and the anchors of this movement, that now machines are looking at us and what do they say about this movement. So, starting the speculation, and that's eventually to Sally, would you consider that we're in front of new aspects really, or this is anchored so much in other references that we are, again, remediating other things, and remediation is something that we really can't escape from?
Yeah.
Please.
Thank you. Okay, so are we in a new aesthetic regime, or is this a continuity?
Exactly.
Okay, this is thank you for inviting me. This is indeed a challenge because Fernando asked us not to prepare anything specific because we want to open up discussion, particularly with you as much as across the panel. So my approach to the so-called new aesthetics is that we need to bear in mind the shock of the old, as David Edgerton wonderfully put it, and that we need to sort, or to try to sort, what constitute genuinely radical extensions of our sensory and therefore our cognitive capabilities with respect to the past, as opposed to what constitutes continuous enhancements of human technical and cognitive capacity, since we've stood on two legs. So I'm always very torn in this discussion. For me, the question does remain. Obviously, we have orders of magnitude of difference in our perceptive capacities in 2015 with respect to 150 or 20 years ago, by virtue of big data, by virtue of machinic processualities and computational abilities that are not ours anymore. And
I think it's off, the speaker, I think it's off. The mic.
okay, sorry.
Can you repeat?
Can I repeat? Oh my God. Okay, sorry, I'm looking at my colleagues and not at you. Is this audible? Oh, you mean I have to say that again? Okay. Oh, okay, I'll try again, and I will try to be succinct. Right. Thank you. Okay, to summarize what I just said, are we dealing with new aesthetics, or are we dealing with a continuation of existing extensions to and enhancements of our technical and our cognitive abilities? That's kind of the question as I read it. My answer is mixed because I think it's both. I think that ever since we stood on two legs, which was the first major technical enhancement of our sensory apparatus, if we consider being human an enhancement, rather than being four-legged animals. But ever since we stood up and began to develop cerebral volume and began to climb trees and use our hands in different ways, we began to forge tools and we began to intervene in our environment technically in ways that meant that there was a co-shaping process going on. So our technologies and our tools are necessarily folded into our cognitive development, and we've been doing this ever since we scraped the first piece of flint. That's an old story. The new story for me is the fact that in recent decades, computational, networked computational power is taking us far beyond things that we as individuals can comprehend. We are receiving signals from our satellites. We're receiving data overloads from things that are circling our planet and beyond that we cannot grasp at an individual cognitive level. And so there's a question of order of magnitude that puts us in a very different position and that perhaps justifies talking about something new. I'm interested, as I said earlier, in the theory of somebody like David Edgerton, who talks about the shock of the old, because I think we tend to be intimidated and mystified, rightly, probably, by the scales of newness, to the extent that we forget how radically scales of newness have affected human beings in the past. So the question of aesthetics, augmented aesthetics, is a term I have some difficulties with, because I'm not sure whether what we're talking about is actually aesthetics, or whether it is a broader cultural transformation. And I think those are two very different things. In my understanding of aesthetics, this is something that requires and draws on historic cultural legacies. And I'm happy to talk about augmented aesthetics if we can simultaneously talk about deepened aesthetics. I think notions of breadth are valuable. We have enhanced exosomatic organs, was the term I used earlier. This is a philosopher called Robert Innes who talks about our technological extensions as being instruments, apparatus, but also the social contexts in which they become usable. So we have these extended exosomatic organs, but at the same time we are cultured beings who have been devising ways of looking at the world through artistic artifacts for a couple of thousand years at least, and probably many more thousands of years. So my answer is a non-answer. It's another question, which is what you said we came to do. I'm not sure whether we're in new aesthetics, because I'm not sure whether the real issue is aesthetics per se. I am not going to dispute the newness of the scales of information processing that we are tuned to and that we are having to integrate somehow. But I'm not entirely convinced that much of the work that's parading itself as new aesthetics is necessarily aesthetic or artistic work.
Sure. And a quick word of thanks for inviting me to this panel, which came as a surprise. The first thing I said is I know nothing about this subject. And then Fernando said, it took me a while to understand what he meant by that's the point, but I finally got it, I think. It's new, and therefore there is no expert. It's a collective kind of endeavor that we need to accept and scrutinize, and possibly in many ways intuitively. I would like to begin this first contribution by emphasizing the lexical aspect of the terminology that is being used, and while subscribing to Sally's point in regards to aesthetics, believing that actually the transformation goes a lot deeper, I would emphasize the expression new aesthetics and the expression augmented aesthetics. Seem to be fairly interchangeable in this presentation, but they both converge and point towards something which I find very, very interesting, which is the fact that they're both new and augmented qualifications that are neither semantic, nor stylistic, or social, or cultural. They emphasize issues of time and scale. And what they're saying is that there's something going on that is at the now, that is big. Those are the two certainties that those terms give us, provide us. If we add indeed this level of intuition that we're invited to, let's say, embody these days, because so much of our certainties have just kind of evaporated quite quickly, and we accept this state of volatility as a starting point and not an end point, I think that's really when things may start getting interesting. And that's when I said yes to Fernando. All right, let's all think together about this. I would probably like to bring first and foremost the name of one of our colleagues, Clive Wilno from Parsons University, that proposes that there is indeed a shift, or there has been a shift when technology ceases to rely on the mechanical paradigm whereby each tool served one purpose. And we entered the paradigm where technology becomes endlessly reconfigurable according to our own individual desires, needs, and whims. And in that sense, subjectivity is an interesting territory because it's both very intimate, but in 2015 there's this kind of invitation for intimacy to be out in the open. And how do we work out this conundrum? Maybe that's where this new aesthetics proposes something interesting. I believe there's a kind of very strong seductiveness in these artifacts that we just saw some examples of, precisely because we have this suspicion and often certainty that there's no soul behind them. And the soullessness of the generative or the automated is quite seductive, and it puts us often in a sort of state of hypnosis. I believe because there's a comfort in this lack of the other. Since there's nobody there, there's no one to confront or be confronted by. You just relax and enjoy the ride because hey, nobody's asking any questions. So there's maybe this kind of feeling of freedom in this ambivalence of the possible lack of authorship and the lack of intent that is then endlessly reconfigurable, as Fernando just pointed out, by adding a certain soundtrack, kind of meaning that isn't there, and kind of imagine or project seems to shift and go somewhere else. So I believe it's interesting to, and I'm getting to answering your question, not think so much in terms of rupture versus remediation, as much as it might be interesting to start looking at the kinds of lexicons that surround these recent phenomena in order to understand that the words that we're using themselves to describe these recent phenomena, they're actually charged with something that has supposedly gone out of fashion, which is called ideology. I believe that's actually an interesting aspect that we should be looking closely into. Because when we say new, we all come from the assumption that new is good. That's what we're being told. Or maybe not us, but we kind of study this stuff. Research, we ask questions. A lot of people accept that as a self-evidence. And the same thing with, let's say, overabundance. The fact that all of these phenomena are taking place everywhere. And we kind of decide that this is a good idea and we should embark in it without actually thinking about the possible advantages of scarcity and selectiveness and rigor. And the same thing I would say with playfulness. There's something about this new aesthetic which is very, very polarized. On one hand, it's fun. It's great fun. Nobody gets fun, of course. But on the other hand, let's not forget that a lot of these source materials actually originally come from contexts that are anything but fun. So maybe I wouldn't say that the rupture resides so much in terms of a historical continuity as much as it resides within ourselves. We're the ones who are
You
do you feel that you're inside the circle that you aesthetics and draw? Do you feel comfortable with it?
Not so much, honestly. Well, maybe I do feel comfortable because I almost think that the term is properly placed by calling it a new aesthetic. Sorry? Yeah. I find that it almost is placed in a way, by calling it an aesthetic, I always find the word aesthetic kind of flat in many ways. If you talk about an aesthetic, you talk about like a kind of the feel of this table. It's like a Michelin style or with Italian curves. So I find that word to be quite short, and just to kind of be the wet blanket of the panel. I almost feel like the new aesthetic is very much like a trendy type thing. I think most of the new aesthetic comes from this subsect of people that like, this is just mean to say, but they kind of enjoy this world of 3D printing and like digital fabrication, and I think it kind of ends there. But I think what Sal is talking about is much more interesting. We talk about like less than an aesthetic, but more about like a sensibility. We start to think about like a generation that has now been born into full fluency with computers. Like a generation below me is the one that came into this world using computers, and now you see babies and like think paper and screens are no different. And they try and like use magazines and touch them. It's because there's this kind of shift that's been broken down into their understanding of it, which I find more interesting. Like to give an example, one I keep thinking about in terms of expression is an artist which we all know, Pat McDonald, is kind of leading the forefront of some of these tools. Like I think the computer vision you saw, a big portion of that is written by him. He's very good at writing these kind of face tracking algorithms that check for sensibilities and like can pick out people. Very much an engineer. But one of the most powerful works I've seen using his tool set was by this 17-year-old from a university in the States, from art school. And what he had done was he had reenacted. So the tool, for example, it lets you swap your face with someone else's. So you can become like Britney Spears, you can become like Brad Pitt. And it works quite well. So what he did was, using this tool set, he acted out through webcam the story of when he came out as a young gay man to his parents, and like kind of tried to role play what it would be like. So he made two characters, one that was him and one that was him as female, and like performed this idea of the sexuality in relation to that. And it's like the fact that Kyle made this tool as like kind of a straight male engineer, he probably wouldn't have the balance to imagine this world. But as like a child growing into a world of computation, like his sensibilities and understanding that there isn't life and there isn't tools, and it's not like life and engineering. It's just kind of this melting pot. And he sees like a computer and his sexuality, his identity, and his parents all intersecting. So I don't know, for me, that's kind of the way I find it much more interesting. But when we think about like, and maybe it's not a new aesthetic, but it's kind of a new life.
It's a life. So I think the criticism that the panel elaborated on about the aesthetics is also kind of reason that's been going around the community. That one of the things that isn't nearly enough. Basically, it kind of draws this circle around a lot of things that became quite common, to say, naturally to new generations. And even this, one of the things that they mentioned, which is crossover from virtual to physical, is the criticism comes from sometimes it's just interact to repeating images printed on textiles or in the architecture or whatever, or keep using a World of Warcraft packs or something like that. But replacing another reality, which is this total magical lighting, the virtual coming direct to the physical world, not by just the reference of the virtual world, but really coming physically, being in digital fabrication or in the final fabrication or whatever. So if it's not weird enough, so probably just a term that encompasses a lot of naturalizations of creative intelligence. But with this augmentation of senses and the possibility of physical implementation of the creative process, could we be at a possible singularity moment of where we could really get a kind of essentialism to emerge, not just remediation? What would have to happen to that? So basically, coming to a field that is very close to self and life. A life focused on the artwork in emergence was the art forms and the properties of the art forms and the process that generated the art forms. But we're now at another level where these art forms can become intelligent in societies, and eventually from those societies, culture can emerge. And the question is, will we understand that culture? Do you think this fusion of these elements, that's something really then new, not just augmented, but really new that can emerge?
That we're new again. I just want to, I think we kind of owe an apology to James Bridle and the new aesthetics guys, because I feel they've come up for a lot of flack, and actually the new aesthetic panel and the Tumblr blog material, I think have been very productive for our community. So, and as we discussed earlier, Fernando, James Bridle himself wasn't very happy with the term. So I think I would feel dishonest if we kept thrashing it without owning up for him. It's a convenience term. And I think looking at the images that he puts together of a very, very radically transformed social fabric for the part of the world that we live in, and not the entire planet, I think that's something that we should point out. In terms of A-line and this coding matter and mixing the real and the virtual, okay, I come from theatre studies, and the first machine was the Greek machine that parachuted the gods in to save the day. You know, Deus ex machina. Now, the humans are trying to parachute themselves into the machine playground of the Internet of Things to try and understand it. This is an interesting development over 2,500 years. And I think maybe we should be looking at the ways that we have always been mixing the physical and the symbolic. We're talking about computational operations, mathematical operations, they're symbolic operations. Algorithmic operations are symbolic. They're becoming close to the body when they're becoming embedded in material processes. But I think, again, without wanting to sound like some die in the wood or whatever it is, historian, we have always done this hybridization and mixing. When I talk about mixes of code and material to my anthropologist colleagues who work, for example, in India or in various animist cultures in Africa or South America, they say that humans have been doing this all the time. We have been investing symbolic presences into our material environment ever since we were capable of symbolic thinking. We're doing it in another way now, and we're doing it at another scale. What I find interesting about the music track on the back of the robot-readable world is that that's a translation device. We're dealing with visual systems that somehow we've invented, and we're trying to understand those visual systems and relate them to our affective, fragile, individual sensibilities. I love the word that Alex used. And the way that we do that is to work through these kind of culturally coded materials, like a music score, that's actually quite comfortable. It's familiar. So it de-alienates this kind of vision. And so maybe this is where, when Bruce Sterling says it's got to be more weird, maybe what he's getting at is that if we are only turning these strange new constructs into yet another comfort zone, de-alienating them with this kind of mushy stuff that we're all familiar with, then we're not grappling with them as we need to be. We're not really conceptually wrestling with them as we need to. I'm a fan of Viktor Shklovsky, the early 20th century Russian formalist, who said that art is about slowing down perception. It's about creating new kinds of temporal understandings of the world around us. It's about hinging somebody's attention on something in a way that is not normal. And by slowing down and creating a kind of a jagged edge on our perceptive processes, then we're taken into a slightly different perceptive and cognitive space. That's the weird stuff. And for me, that's where aesthetics really kicks in. It's not in this kind of mediating comfort zone of how do I turn this big-scale, superhuman phenomenon into something that poor little me can grasp.
This is the pattern. Understanding is a good word, and it's also very difficult, and maybe that's why it's good. I would like momentarily to go back to the concept that I mentioned before, the concept of the other. The idea that maybe part of the seductiveness of these kinds of materials is the suspicion at the very least there's nobody behind them, at least not immediately on the first level. But maybe there is a kind of other that emerges, which is precisely something that is beyond our immediate grasp. And therefore, the question of understanding what is going on becomes a struggle when our immediate compulsion is to actually interpret, integrate, and project what we already know and dominate. I'm not so concerned about this idea that we're living some kind of singularity in terms of art, because actually, to be honest, art has already performed many different, very different roles throughout history, as we know. And in a way, it would be very, very strange to imagine that it would end up here forever. So yes, it will mutate and continue. But the big question is not so much the understanding, because the other, the big whole, as an abstraction, therefore the one that is not me, is always beyond the grasp anyway. I can never be the other, therefore I can never understand the other fully. The question really is if I'm ready to accept that and integrate that level of uncertainty into my own existence.
What about the other is abstract entity divided by artificial intelligence? Would there be some understanding, some outline where it can emerge?
Sure.
I was asking what if this other is an artificial agent, and how this relation evolved and be established? That would be good to the audience.
Yeah.
So I think that this would bring a mirror that is still missing.
Yeah, I mean, if I may, I think Sarah just pointed out something absolutely spot on, which is the fact that the soundtrack to this video is actually deeply conservative. And this is not a judgment, it's a beautiful piece of music, whatever it is, I have no idea. But it obeys to extremely traditional canons and definitions of how sound organizes itself in the corporate music. Why this contrast? What is it telling us? And I think I completely agree. What it's doing is, in a way, taming the abyss that the images contain. But the problem is we learn how to live with the ethics. We're not going to do it.
So again, we get the prosthetics that help us. Something that we can relate to that is more traditional, more conventional ways that provide the difference.
We might. I think prosthetics should be regarded as tools for our own betterment, whatever that might mean, existentially, humanly, aesthetically, socially, culturally. The most important thing is maybe to be reminded that we are at a time where the main challenge is not so much social but individual. I've been saying for a while now that I believe that actually the word revolution in 2015 needs to be understood on an individual level, because really that's where it starts and ultimately where it ends. So as far as I'm concerned, it's about your own capacitation. And that's a challenge that is actually quite intimate and quite a lonely process. There's a huge amount of stuff happening that can help you do that. And equally, the ways of handling that in order to fulfill whatever you're supposed to fulfill as a human being. Possibilities are endless too. It's up to you and you alone. Sorry to be getting very philosophical, but you know, I'm not an expert at this.
I'll just add, from kind of like practitioner senses, how it's labeled. So I'm working in my own design studio and we do some things, but at the same time, I was working with Disney before and now with Google, and it's quite interesting because I think as Sally's pointing out, from a company perspective like that, there is this amazing conservativeness that happens, where artists obviously don't have the same boundaries that a company like that would have. Like the most amazing example was, if you look back, you can Google it, back in the 70s, there was this artist, he was in the UK, I think. But basically, he had done this thing where he had taken his tripod and his camera and strapped it to the top of his car, and then would drive around his small town and take pictures of everything, and stream it together into videos. And so basically what it was Google Maps and Google Street View. But at the time, people couldn't accept that, or for one reason or another. In the 70s, it didn't happen. Maybe it wasn't interesting at the time, maybe actually I think the internet and bandwidth wasn't done. But now you see that's essential for all of us, like the Street View. Another interesting thing, which I'm sure you guys saw in the past weeks, this new machine learning algorithm that's come out, where they're generating these images of like animals' faces. If you take a normal image and you put it through this deep learning algorithm, it's called deep learning, you get these insane images that morph from like something familiar to something like alien, but that is also familiar. If you don't know, it's basically, this is a longer explanation maybe for later, but classically we had this idea of machine learning. You teach a machine patterns, and when you show it something new in the future, it will show you something back. But there's this relationship between, as a human, I take these things and I ask the computer what the pattern is. So it's a taught thing. But now within deep learning, the differentiation is we no longer have to show the computer something. We can let the computer go into the world and search for it and bring it back. And it'll tell us something, so we don't have to prompt it anymore. But again, the interesting part is this idea of deep learning isn't new. I mean, it's something that came out in the 90s. There were like really good algorithms by computer scientists then. But once they put it into this construct of like images and Google images, basically when they found the right data set of Google images, like the general public can understand. But when you talk to some of my friends that are machine learning experts, they like roll their eyes because they're just like, whatever, this is nothing new. But it's interesting because I think there's this necessary relationship between what we can understand, because most of us in this room would be interested by like an algorithm written on paper. We are interested by images. So there's this tool that we need, which is a vehicle to understand it, and like just so it's interesting. But also there's this other thing that's new that is probably older. So it's like they're in this relationship where you need them both, but it's like having to push one and keep the other. I don't know if that makes any sense. Yeah.
the deep learning reference is a useful one. I was thinking of the fact that we're trying to deal with these questions of scale, of scale of big data, of scale of perceptive possibilities, of scale of monitoring phenomena that we weren't even aware of, decades ago. And in the old days, we had a contrivance, a cultural way of handling big data and scales that were superhuman, and this was called mythology. And in my home country, Aotearoa, New Zealand, there are all kinds of stories that explain volcanoes and earthquakes and eclipses, and they're all stories about gods beating up the sun and beating up each other. But they give us a cognitive grasp on phenomena that we can't grasp otherwise. So I think we're in a really interesting position at the moment, and perhaps this is where the news comes in, where scientific tools and techniques are suddenly flooding us with scales of events and phenomena that we have to devise mechanisms to understand in a hurry. And so I find it interesting what some artists are doing with this. I think that Graham Harwood's Net Monster project, where he built portraits out of simply he unleashed an algorithm on image material on the internet. This is 10, 15 years ago, and built up these incredible composite portraits out of aggregates of keywords and visual iconographic references on the internet. Net Monster is a fantastic piece of work. It's static now, but it's a historic reference. And I think there are efforts to deal with scale like that are really interesting. But the real danger is what Heitor wonderfully described as taming the phenomenon without really understanding it. Throw a big velvet cloak over it and some nice music and some pretty colours, and that's fine, we can deal with it. But don't lift up the corner and hide it, because there's a monster under there. So I feel that arts generally have a really interesting challenge, which is to provide enough anchorage points or enough hooks for us to be able to actually comprehend and latch on to the processes that are being put on the table, but at the same time not to downplay their enormity, not to downplay their monstrosity. And that's a razor edge. It's a tough call, but that's why I have difficulty with some work using the term aesthetics, because for me aesthetics, of course, traditionally it refers to beauty, but I think it refers to something that is actually profoundly moving and in a way deeply disturbing. And we need to be dealing with this deeply disturbing stuff.
Alexandra, do you remember that director at the Biennale does like a really quick cutting of like teenagers that are like covered in glitter? I mean, he's like a big American artist.
Covered in glitter.
He's a trans, but just to highlight Sally's thing, there's this amazing artist, American, who cuts video. But what he does is like, the video is like of him and his friends in these narrative fictions they make up in their house. And it's like, they make these really like kitsch scenes of like a cave and like a party. But what's happening is like he cuts in every like 2 to 3 seconds. So it's like this narrative's happening and they're like screaming and there's like pain, and like you watch it, and I like, when I first watched it, I like hated it because it's like these teenagers and it just like really hurts your eyes. But when you come back and you watch it again, you start to realize, you start to make this connection between how we watch like YouTube or video. Because often you find artists now, they lock this capability on video so that you can't jump ahead in video. Because I do this all the time where I'm like trying to see if their work is any good. So I jump 5 seconds. Like I'll watch 30 like a millisecond. Jump. So by making this artwork, it does that for you. It's a whole narrative where everything is just milliseconds cut apart. It's like insane, like your eyes asking for as people and what we want. But then, as Sally said, there's like this monstrosity that you start to hate it. But he's also kind of holding up a mirror to like what we do in free time, which I think is really powerful. If I think of it, I'll tell you his name.
Finally, after you were mentioning the more better words, you were when we were talking about the YouTube. Husband, the neck.
Yeah.
Exactly. Well, based on the premise that at least in my point of view, this really emerge probably if we let AI merge with artificial artists or artificial culture, cutting the bonds with the models that at a certain point can be applied, at least to validate the process. But Sally has a fantastic phrase that I appropriate here and quote. What will emerge out of this would test our ability to identify fundamentally alien phenomena, which is invariably constrained by our cognitive apparatus and habits. And what I can somehow extract from your opinions and your previous comments is that somehow, that's how I brought this prosthetics, is that somehow it is something, and now we're going into really speculative speculation. Something really emerges that eventually you probably would recognize it, or then it would have to be eventually collaborative, not just an artificial artist, but this hybrid society of human artists and audience somehow. We would have to really clearly identify something that would have to be a collaborative effort, something radically emerge out of that, transformative, to understand it as artistic manifestation, robots or machines or whatever. Because just to set up also, we will talk about deep learning examples, and something has to be, I think, very interesting to listen to this video that is a robot real world. Is that in reality it's not a robot real world. It's again adding a layer for us to understand. Basically, robots are looking at quality of play, or looking at motion flow, the way it is. This is adding to the algorithm. This is an expression of what the algorithms are really measuring so that we can understand. So it's not even robot real world. They wouldn't need to add all these layers. So if it is exactly that an invisible field in this creative aspect would be really new and understand the requirements somehow. Coming from that, and I think your previous reflections on it and on your sentence will eventually the artificial artists create completely artists. We as human audience the model they are basing their creation is no longer something that is built up on top of classic aesthetics itself, traditions. This is
That's complicated. I'll
I'm
try.
jumping into science fiction.
No, I'll try. There's a wonderful passage because you mentioned science fiction and providing models of some of the things we're trying to understand. And I think it's Count Zero, the William Gibson book, where he talks, there's a character in that book, I haven't read it for a long time, but there's a character who was involved in museum and cultural kind of circles. And there's a little passage where this character says, looking at these museum artifacts, says, how could they have arranged those pieces in that way so that they snag the heart like a fish hook? You know, and it's, I'm not quoting it literally, but it's beautiful. It's a sentence, and you think, my God, how did he say that? There's something about the way that art as a collective, as a shareable construct, allows us to develop empathy and collective understanding, or even if it's not understanding, a collective sensibility, to use Alice's term again, around something that we can't quite grasp, that I think is really important. For me, that's what art is about. So, an artificial artist, I don't know. I mean, I think in a way, John Cage and Duchamp, they stopped constructing, but of course they didn't. They're wonderful bluffers, both of them. They framed existing material and said, look at this. And I give you art. I mean, Cage was an absolute dictator of chance. You know, once you were tied up actually composing a piece of his work by chance, you had to do that then because the archive said you had to do that then. But they were devising completely new, non-human constructs for building artwork. And I think in some ways you could say that Cage and Duchamp perhaps are preparing the terrain for our frame grabs and our fast edits of artificial life artists of the future. I don't know. I think our cultural legacies give us a lot more equipment than we remember, especially in 2015 when we talk about new aesthetics.
Sure, that's that of if we should open the...
Can I say a few words into this? Because I think when we're speaking about art and the possibility of art being made by robots, machines, I think it's probably important to emphasize that at a certain point in history, art became not so much about the construction of things as much as it became about the perception and interpretation of those very same things. So maybe the point here is not so much to devise again attain the taxonomy of what is possible, as much as it is to cultivate, and I emphasize individually, what I call an ecology of perception. And it's a duty that these days seems to be very much focused on the individual, in large part because of that sense of mythology. Myth is traditionally the territory that has brought us together. And it's interesting because just yesterday I was teaching a class and we were looking through a bunch of images, a lot of them art, or could be considered art, and all of a sudden we were stopped in our tracks by that image of the child that drowned on the coast of the Mediterranean. And I said to the students, here is an image of a different category. It's a monumental image. It's something that is so much bigger than us and itself and its circumstances, that all we can do is cultivate deep respect for what it means. And I think in a way that's maybe a clue as to what mythology can be in 2015 and how it may surface. But for that to happen, it's an individual duty to cultivate that ecology of perception. And I think when we speak of art these days, the emphasis should be on perception and not so much on the object itself. And what we do with what we see, each one.
So just to kind of continue my trend of examples, which I find, I think of when Sally mentions these things. So originally I went to art school as a sculptor, and slowly transitioned into new media. And I still find myself constantly not referencing the new media, but referencing some of that older work from sculpture and whatnot. And one of the pieces which I think was the most powerful to me was there's an artist, Fred Wilson, who I think is kind of a modern version of what John Cage was in the past predecessors. Where Fred Wilson, he's like an African-American artist, and he's really concerned with just how you pick out objects and then place them together, like objects from life and whatnot. So, and I bring this up because there was recently this piece by James Bridle, which I like what he was attempting, but I think it falls short when I explain Fred Wilson's, because what James Bridle one who kind of thought of the aesthetic. He made this algorithm with his Victorian Albert residency, where he started picking out works and placing them together like a curator would do, but done algorithmically, where he would the computer would kind of tell him abstract connections in work. That's possibly not about history or about art, but it's like if two pieces share a shipping crate, or if both weigh 2 grams, or even if they're both from the same year, like connections that don't matter to the normal curator, but a computer can see these connections. And he did it, and it's kind of interesting because you see these works that are really transparent and they sit together in a glass case. But at the time, it's more about the algorithm than it is about the work. Whereas I think on the flip side is Fred Wilson, who is very much a sculptor and collector. He did this piece with his residency in the States. I forget what it was. But what they did was they said, here's our museum, do whatever you want with it. And they were hoping that he would make something as an artist would do. But instead what he did was he went through the American history collection and started picking out objects of relevance. So he went to, for example, kind of the British silverware and pottery section and found the ornate objects from British history there. And then at the same time, in the same year, went to the Americas, where slavery was at an all-time high. And he started picking out the chains of some of the early slaves that had connections to the same areas in England. And then he took these silver pottery that's 100% silver and puts it with the chain that is just full steel. And then when you read the description that it just has the year and that's it, to me that pulls in so many heartstrings that I'm just like, oh my gosh. And so I bring it back to just say I find the algorithm interesting and the connections is quite something, but the kind of pure humanity and the fact that he's an African-American artist whose family has ties to London and he's able to, as an artist, hold these two things, in his modern life and put them together, just is means so much more to me. So I don't know, I question if computers and algorithms can ever overcome the human idea of just knowing what your identity is and constantly struggling with what that is, as we do.
So in this idea of discussing no longer art made with computers, but computers made with art, I would now invite you to take part of it and participate in this speculative. So, silent the Lord and just proceed that.
I'd like to put a question to Sally. Departing from when she says that we must think augmented aesthetics, maybe in connection with broader cultural transformations. And maybe through transformations that we are testifying in knowledge. We face hybrid knowledges nowadays that mix that fusion, science, technology, and art. And so, and even the everyday knowledge. So, aesthetics is knowledge. And so, maybe we could think aesthetics, augmented aesthetics, as some kind of hybrid, some kind of practical aesthetics that could go with this mixing, with this hybridization of several knowledges. And how? That's the question. And when you spoke about what I think is very interesting, the Internet of Things, I myself am working with Web3, semantic web, and we talk as well on symbols and virtual, the new virtual, the new myths that maybe can appear in our contemporaneity. So my question is, maybe we could cope with this complex situation by developing more sensitive methods, more methods that could hybridize scientific methods, artistic methods, and so on. There's a big discussion on that, on the opportunity of artistic methods, even on science, and maybe to arrive to something that we could name sort of research as performance, as a sort of collective gathering of people that includes scientists, artists, and common people, citizens, to develop new knowledges that could give this dimension of practicability to our understanding, to our collective understanding.
Great, thank you. Thanks, those are wonderful and deep questions. I won't be able to fully do them justice. I think they're very judicious. Aesthetics is a form of knowledge that allows us to perhaps generate syntheses of existing or other knowledge forms and to actually pull them together in new ways. Yes, I think that's what I'm getting at when I'm talking about art as being the heir, the successor of mythology, and that it makes these leaps. It can actually, art is in a position to throw together different kinds of knowledge and different forms of knowing that in any other context it would be unreasonable or illegitimate to throw together. So I think that is a privilege and a prerogative of art, and we should use it. You say how? Well, ask the artist. Okay, one model that I find very interesting is a tandem, a couple in Brighton called Semiconductor. It's a concrete example, who have been working with various science and astronomy bodies over the years, and they have been generating, they used the scientific data from the Berkeley Space Lab to generate a piece of work from solar recordings of solar flares and different kinds of solar activity. And they use the raw data, which usually gets cleaned up by the Berkeley Astrophysics Lab. They liked the raw data because it generated much richer sonic and visual material for them as artists. Their position was, we are not here to illustrate or to interpret the scientific data. We are here to take it somewhere else and to put it on a different affective plane. So I think that's for me, that's an example of a how that I really like. Actually, they've just been granted an artist residency at CERN in Geneva, and given their integrity as artists, which is to say we're not just scientific illustrators, I think it's very good that they're doing this. Your question about methods and knowledge and research as performance, I think in some ways science and technology studies, Bruno Latour and Andrew Pickering and all these people who talk about the manual of practice, who talk about epistemic action, engaging with materialities in order to learn and to know. I think there is an amazing amount of crossover between these communities if you look in the right places, and it's increasing. I exchange reasonably regularly with a quantum physicist called Karen Barat, who's based in University of California, Santa Cruz. She's written a fantastic book on quantum physics and entanglements of knowledge systems. And she says she's now working on quantum field theory, as though quantum theory in mechanics isn't enough. She says that the concepts that she's dealing with are mathematically too sophisticated to lend themselves to conventional discursive analysis. And she wants, and she's beginning to get, contact with artists because they are able to bypass discursive methods and systems of the traditional scientific kind. So I think there is, the practice turn, the epistemic turn, all of these terms, we're all turning at the moment. But actually there are some very exciting crossovers between these art and science and methods and empirically grasping materials and processes. this is going on. I personally find that it's probably the most exciting area of current artistic experimentation. So thank you for your question.
Hello?
Yes?
Is this thing on? So first, I have to second a lot of the things that you said about aesthetics, because aesthetics aren't just a look and feel issue. I think aesthetics communicate a lot about a culture, communicate a lot about time, of the time in which, the historical time in which the object or whatever artwork was created, design, etc. Right? So the study of aesthetics is a work in progress, right? The thing that I want to mention though is because this new aesthetics thing is a big, pet peeve of mine. I don't think that there's anything new about new aesthetics, nor is there anything new about, as you said, the historical moment that we're living in. This has happened before. Technology has come before that has completely changed the way we perceive the world. In fact, several technologies have come before that have completely changed the way we perceive the world. But I'll just give you an example of one, and that's literacy. Literacy absolutely changed the way we can even think. If you ask somebody in a pre-literate society a question that involves abstract symbolic logic, so essentially, if A then B, or if right, the classic logical syllogism, right? If A then B, if you get B, do you? If A happens, do you indeed get B? People in pre-literate societies do not know how to understand or answer that question because all of their knowledge is functional. It's not about abstract things. Literacy has enabled us to think in a much more abstract way. And in fact, there are several surveys that prove simple facts like these. Most of the knowledge of pre-literate societies has to be functional by nature because if you don't have books, if you can't write, you can't remember things like we can. And by virtue of having that technology that augments our memory, we've been able to free our mind, if you will, to think in different ways. Sure, we do not have the long-term memories of pre-literate society. I mean, their capacity to remember things that happen around them is astounding to anybody that is of a literate background. But what we can do by creating this, essentially, this memory prosthesis, is to be able to think abstractly about the world. So it's useful to go back and understand how these certain historical events have actually shaped the way we think, because we may very well be in that moment right now, right? A moment in which we shifted from non-literacy to literacy. And maybe now we're shifting into a moment where information was not as convenient to access, and now we have just access to anything we want immediately, right? So there may be a shift undergoing culture in general. It may be that it leads to new modes of thinking. But I think that making the historical comparison, it's not just instructive, but I think essential.
No, it's a good point. I would have brought that up because I think you might be referencing or have read Neil Postman's work, Technopoly. It's this book, Technopoly, is called The Dying of Cultures. And it's exactly this. It's a really good point. But he's making the argument, or many people have, but this idea that with each advent of a technology, our cognitive ability shifts and part of our culture dies, but something else advances. So as you were saying, it's exactly that. It's like before we had written word or written text, we could remember much longer. And another interesting example he puts in there is strangely enough, it was, as he referenced, that clocks, or the need for a sundial, as it were, was originally something invented by the Plunc culture, because they wanted to find out that like 2 and 3 times in a day, or certain periods of the day, they wanted to sit and meditate. But the interesting part was that invention of the clock led partially to the use in the Industrial Revolution. So in the Industrial Revolution, they needed these clocks that you came to work at a time and left at a time. And then you came and left longer and longer. So eventually this idea of meditation left completely, even though it was their technology. So it's a very good point. There's this like strange dichotomy between innovation and death and how we change as people that I think is maybe the true answer to what like Lewis said would be.
Which leads us to the answer that Fernando was handling. It is radiation.
Going out in essence, wow.
We failed.
I would like to back on that one too. I'd just like to say that, yeah, literacy and the ability, mnemonic prostheses and sophisticated symbolic reasoning are hugely important developments. At the same time, as we know, given the state of the Anthropocene today, these freewheeling symbolic powers that we have acquired have not been totally beneficial for our planet and our environment and indeed our own longer-term survival. And this is where I think we have an incredible responsibility. I like that word because it means ability to give a response, so it means that we are individually answerable. We have a responsibility to see in a more collective and trans-species way, whether we belong to literate or pre-literate societies, how we might use these symbolic powers that we've developed more constructively. I think there were some interesting examples in this room yesterday with the boy, the crowdsourced water monitoring systems, these kinds of collectives that are building up around these systems and that are technologically literate and yet that are able at the same time to tap into deep local knowledges. If we talk about memory, in Aotearoa, somebody who introduces themselves recites their whakapapa, their genealogy. And their whakapapa actually tells you what mountain they were born by, what river they were born by, how their tribes moved around the landscape. And actually, what that tells you is a whole lot about the natural environment that you wouldn't learn from somebody like me who was just brought up with a birth certificate, which is a nice piece of registered mnemonic prosthetic writing for a symbolic civilization.
And I wasn't making a value judgment.
No, I realize that.
Right. I mean, because it's mostly right.
Chris, what I'm trying to say, I'm not kicking back at you because I know that we could do this for a long time. We can do it down in the pub later. But I think what the opportunity that we have now is to actually bring together to come back to this earlier notion of multiple knowledge systems. We have situated knowledges of many different kinds. We have specialist knowledges of many different kinds. We now have tools and platforms that allow us to test their convergences. And so I think that's what's really interesting.
But quickly, I would add just very short, that very same symbolic, the ability to process abstract symbolic thought has, yes, endangered our existence here on this planet, but it also enables us to realize that we engender this, that we could potentially engender this catastrophe, right? So it sort of comes both ways, right?
Well, this doesn't work, so this is symbolic. Battery is over. Sophia doesn't move.
Hello, hi. This is just a quick question and comment on the idea that this is not new and that we've been through these deeply transformative technologies in the past. I just would like to disagree for the sake of the debate. Because what I think is new, and I can't think of an example from the past, is a technology that is so deeply transformative and that is also autonomous. Because other tools that we have been using and other technologies, we still control them. But now we're creating these artifacts that need to have autonomy. You don't get to deep learning if you don't give autonomy to the algorithm. Okay? So, and then I think we're coexisting with this, we're sharing autonomy with other types of entities. And that I can't think that it has happened in the past.
I believe one of the qualities of contemporary present times is encapsulated in one word, which is the word paradox. And maybe again it has existed throughout history, but we are living at a time which is both intensely new, like you described, but also one step further down some kind of spiral, which is called time. So I think both apply. It's not new, and yes, it's deeply new. And that's really why I actually at one point said that we are the ones who are breaking apart, because we are being asked individually to reconcile key ideas which are absolute polar opposites, and both stand, and they're both deeply true. So what do we do with this paradox in 2015?
Yeah. Sorry. No, I just want to say thank you, because it's kind of easy afterwards to say this, I entirely agree with you, but it's true. I think this is why, personally, I'm in a quandary about the newness, because I think the scale of the phenomena that we have engendered, these Pandora's box phenomena that have become and are becoming increasingly is new and is scary. I think we've been culturally preparing for it without realizing it, probably over thousands of years, by ascribing autonomy or presence to phenomena that we couldn't understand. But this time we've actually built them and unleashed them. So yeah, thank you.
Well, I wanted to talk from like a perspective of someone that's like very much in between different knowledge and practice, and really trying to find a way, in the process of finding a way how to. So like, I feel that at some point, like coming from practice and then theory and then back to practice, so kind of not trying to like say materialize in theory, but actually develop the process. And I find at some point that I cannot neither write or do these different things as much as someone that does that, right, only. So it's like finding some or more people are finding this crossroads of like finding these new languages, these new art forms. They are trying to surpass these divisions, theory, practice, but the fact, I mean, I want to go somewhere elsewhere, but the fact that the system is constructed with this symbolic power, right? And there are groups, there is like performance, philosophy, these other groups trying to value other forms of knowledge like performance and this. But I think it's, I don't know, feels like this leftist kind of resistance against, although I'm not in positioning myself in this way, but I see this position. We need to resist and find these other ways. So I find very good the proposal of like the collective effort of multiple interdisciplinary fields and people that are already kind of hybridizing themselves and kind of looking for affinities, because I think we're surpassing this okay, now with technology, like you say, we like much more specificities now and all this differentiation, so we going into complexity and the tendencies to homogenization, like the system, like this kind of the paradox I find. But what I find here in terms of like how we're using this symbolic development that we got, all this other abstract thinking, I'm thinking about here neuroaesthetics. That was not very much mentioned, but I think it's interesting value. Another knowledge like mixing things, and I see only a way, and along with Catherine Hales, with this posthumanism, and with, like, we are building these machines more and more intelligent, and soon they will be I believe they will be as intelligent as us, faking. I mean, they are not, but we developed the intelligence before that. But I think, like, the Norbert Nine-Year, like, I think we can do the best as much as collectively as working together with the machine. Like, developing its autonomy, but together with us. And I know this example of this new robot, the Baxter, that I happen to work with, and that he is able to, I mean, they putting him, or he has the capacity of learning all these things, and there is more and more functionality that is like working together. So it's not substituting the humans to do work, but actually achieving more things together. And this is like something from the beginning of cybernetics, like this guy did that kind of. So I think, I mean, there is really good ways, like, of course, the new is not good, but I think I think the art in terms of like doing something here, like to making sense of what's going on, because I think people getting more and more lost and powerless, looking like there is really an illusion of democracy. The more democratic it seems the system and the possibilities, the more control, and so that's the paradox. And I think, yeah, I agree that arts are the only kind of the field that can better like contribute to make sense of and just to finish the part that we don't understand is like the known aspects. Artists need to be counterculture, because if they are just with this accessibility and like bringing art to people, and people need to understand, like almost facilitators of knowledge and being like instrumentalized with other things, I think we destroying, I mean, I think that's mostly what's going on, in destroying completely art thinking.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I mean, I think I get frustrated by some artwork, as it's called, that is like basically not contributing in a certain way. Because I think what's interesting is if you think back to like where a lot of these ideas come from, they come from sci-fi, they come from film. And a lot of times you see this like kind of one-to-one relationship where they think about robots that are autonomous and they take over the world or they help us. But that's such a one-to-one reading of what that movie was talking about. Whereas that movie at the time, if you think about the context it sat in, it's often like the movie is in response to some cultural frustration or kind of thing that society was going through. So it's to think, I mean, the most obvious example being District 9. It's not obviously about aliens, but it's about the director's struggle with apartheid in South Africa. So if you were to say, sci-fi helps us make robots, and that's what's the benefit, it's not that at all, but it's kind of helping break down these walls. And I'm really actually proud of, like, if you're a fan of Ars Electronica, who was kind of the go-to for interactive art every year, saying what was the best piece of the year. One of the best pieces they labeled last year, which I couldn't agree with more, was this website which democratizes tax breaks within Ireland and within the Bahamas. So everyone kind of knows large companies often go to Ireland or the Bahamas because they get tax breaks and they do better that way. So this artist made a website so that any normal person can get the same tax breaks as from other countries. So that frustration of their lives of kind of middle class, and then they did something with it, which I think, as you're kind of pointing out, is a very powerful thing that art can help.
So one, I guess I'm from more of a technical background, and one thing that I've been seeing is that when we were talking about the aesthetics, that we were usually seeing technology as a tool. Like it would maybe help us to see the world in a better place, or what you mentioned, that an artist uses a tool to then curate an exhibition. But we're always actually looking at the person that built the tool there. And I think what's really happening right now is that the tool is evolving from being a tool into a transhuman society, where we get intelligence at a level which is maybe now a 5-year-old, but it's only a question of time until we have intelligence of an actual human level, where machines will get into the discussion of what aesthetics actually are at the same level as a human can be. Like, they have the same right to define or not define what aesthetics are, because unless we have some human superpower, which I don't believe in, they're coming from the same intelligent background. And I think that really changes what aesthetics are, because they're becoming post-human. Like, we're doing a transgression here, which is, I think, not replicable in any past we've had. Exactly from the point where we accepted that apes also had some sort of intelligence. We really accept broadening what aesthetics are from getting from post-humans to also including machines. And I think this is something that has never happened before in history, and that's why it's not just an incremental step, but it's a major breakthrough.
We would almost